I always stayed late to clean the bar. He stayed to mop the floors. We never talked, until that one night changed everything. The club always felt different after closing. Gone were the flashing lights, the pulsing bass, and the blur of conversations and laughter. In their place lingered silence, the low hum of old wiring and the scent of stale liquor mixed with industrial cleaner. Leo had grown used to this shift in atmosphere. It was the only time he ever felt like the space belonged to him. Behind the bar, he wiped down the counters in slow, thoughtful strokes. Not because he had to, but because he liked the ritual of it. The repetition, the silence, it gave him time to think. Outside, the sky had already turned a deep, sleepy blue. The city beyond the grimy club windows moved on without them. Inside, the only light came from the red exit sign above the back door and the soft glow of a string of forgotten fairy lights near the DJ booth. Leo had once tried to take them down, but when he saw how they lit up the empty space just enough to feel like someone had loved it once, he left them. Micah usually came in near the end of the night, a mop in one hand and headphones tucked around his neck. He didn't say much, just nodded when he saw Leo and went about his work. Most of the time, Leo barely noticed him. But lately, there was something about the way Micah moved through the room, unhurried but not lazy, focused but not tense, that made Leo pay attention. That night, the place was emptier than usual. It had been a slow shift, the kind that made Leo wonder why he still worked there. Tips were thin, the crowd had been dull, and even the music felt recycled. He leaned against the bar for a moment, rubbing his temple. He'd been behind that bar for 5 years. Long enough to see the wallpaper peel, the regulars come and go, and the hope he once had slowly drain away. He heard the soft creak of the door near the supply closet. Micah had arrived right on time. As usual, he wore a plain black t-shirt and dark jeans, both stained from nights spent scrubbing down floors most people never noticed. His hair was tucked under a beanie, and his face, though tired, still carried something open. Not naive exactly, just unguarded. Leo didn't speak. He didn't need to. Micah moved like someone who respected silence, someone who understood that not all quiet meant loneliness. There was something comforting about the way he fit into the space, not taking up too much room, but never apologizing for being there either. As Leo continued cleaning the last few glasses, he found himself watching Micah more than he meant to. It wasn't just the rhythm of his movements or the quiet competence he showed. It was the way he seemed to breathe life into the otherwise empty room. The mop glided smoothly across the floor, each stroke pulling the night a little closer to its end. At one point, their eyes met. Brief, unintentional, but something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the quiet, of the shared solitude. Leo looked away quickly, unsure why the moment lingered in his chest. He finished wiping the counter and leaned back against it, arms crossed. Micah was working near the dance floor now, the mop following an invisible pattern only he seemed to know. There was a gentleness to him that didn't match the rough edges of the club. He looked out of place, but not in a bad way, like a whisper in a room full of shouting. Leo let his thoughts drift. He thought about how rarely he connected with anyone these days. Conversations came and went like drinks slid across the bar, brief, surface level, forgettable. But Micah, in his quiet way, had started to feel like more than a background presence. Leo didn't even know much about him, just that he was younger, probably new to the city, and always the last one to leave. And yet, there was something about him that felt familiar, as if they were both holding on to something just beneath the surface. The clock on the wall ticked softly toward 3. Leo sighed, stretching his arms. His shift was officially over, but he didn't feel like leaving. The idea of going home to his tiny apartment, with its flickering kitchen light and the plant he always forgot to water, felt heavier than usual. He noticed Micah pausing, leaning on the mop for a moment, eyes scanning the room like he, too, was reluctant to let the night end. There was no music playing, no crowd left to impress, and yet the room still held them both. It was in that stillness that Leo felt something stir, a feeling he hadn't let himself consider in a long time. A kind of recognition, not just of someone else, but of himself reflected in another. He didn't speak. Neither did Micah. But the quiet between them no longer felt empty. The mop bucket had been wheeled away, the chairs flipped upside down onto the tables, and yet neither of them had made a move to leave. Leo remained behind the bar, a dish towel in his hands he no longer needed, simply twisting it absent-mindedly as his thoughts roamed. Micah had wandered toward the back of the room, pausing near the old jukebox that no one used anymore. The machine was unplugged, its screen dark, but Micah looked at it like it held a memory only he could access. There was a heaviness in the air, not uncomfortable, just dense with the kind of quiet that asked to be listened to. Outside, the city had slowed to a crawl. A siren wailed far in the distance, but here, in the soft blue shadows of the club, time had begun to stretch. Leo's eyes followed Micah, without meaning to. There was something oddly graceful about the way he moved, like he was in sync with a rhythm that only emerged once the music had stopped. Without the mask of the crowd or the role of cleaner, Micah looked more like himself. And for reasons Leo couldn't name, that version of him was impossible to ignore. The bar had always been Leo's safe place, a buffer between him and everyone else. He served drinks, heard confessions, offered smirks and the occasional word of comfort, but never let anyone stay too long in his world. It wasn't out of arrogance or coldness. It was survival. Keeping people at a distance had always felt easier than watching them walk away. Micah, however, had never asked for entry. He just existed quietly within Leo's orbit, and now, unexpectedly, Leo found himself gravitating toward him. Micah circled back toward the bar, resting his hands casually on the edge of the counter. He didn't say anything, just stood there, eyes scanning the room as if trying to memorize its silence. Leo didn't know what compelled him, but he reached beneath the counter and pulled out 2 mugs. He filled them with whatever coffee was left in the pot, lukewarm, slightly bitter, but comforting in its own way. When he slid one toward Micah, the younger man accepted it with a small nod, fingers brushing against Leo's for the briefest second. The touch was accidental, casual, and yet it lingered longer than it should have in Leo's awareness. They stood like that, side by side, both sipping from mismatched mugs, neither of them in a rush to speak. The fluorescent lights were off, leaving only the colored glow of the fairy lights and the weak halo from a street lamp that leaked in through the blinds. It made everything softer, more human. Micah let out a quiet breath, almost a sigh, and leaned against the bar with his forearms. Leo turned slightly to face him. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe a story, maybe a confession. But Micah remained silent, just letting the stillness exist without the need to fill it. That, more than anything, felt rare. Eventually, Leo spoke, his voice low, as if afraid to wake something sacred. He didn't ask a question, didn't make a joke. Just a simple observation about the night being slow. Micah nodded. Then, after a pause, he offered a soft comment of his own, about how quiet could sometimes feel louder than noise. Leo looked at him, surprised not by the sentiment, but by how deeply it resonated. It was a strange moment of alignment. Not flirtation, not tension, just recognition. 2 people who had learned to navigate life from the sidelines, now finding themselves unexpectedly center stage, if only in the eyes of one another. Leo found his gaze drifting, noticing how the light framed Micah's jaw, how his expression shifted in thought, how his presence didn't demand attention but earned it anyway. He realized he wanted to know more, not in the usual detached way he had with strangers, but in the kind of way that asked who are you when no one's looking. Micah finally broke the silence with a quiet observation about how the club felt different after hours. Leo agreed, adding that sometimes the real version of a place only appeared when everyone else had gone. Micah smiled, and Leo felt something warm unfurl in his chest. They talked a little more after that. Nothing dramatic, just fragments. Music they liked, old jobs they hated, the way the city could be both electric and isolating. The conversation flowed without effort, like it had always been waiting for the right moment. Leo didn't realize how late it had gotten until he glanced at the wall clock and saw the minute hand nearing 4. He didn't want to be the first to say it, didn't want to break whatever fragile connection had formed between them. But Micah stood first, cradling the empty mug in both hands. He didn't head for the door immediately. Instead, he lingered a moment, eyes meeting Leo's across the dim bar. There was no invitation in his gaze, no implication, just something open, something quiet. Leo felt it like a question that didn't need answering. Micah set the mug down gently and nodded his good night before walking toward the back exit. Leo watched him go, the soft thud of his steps on the wooden floor marking the end of something that felt like a beginning. When the door clicked shut, Leo remained still, his coffee untouched, heart steady but full. The silence had returned, but now it was different. Now it carried the echo of something left unsaid. By the time Leo stepped out into the chill of the alley behind the club, the city had long since quieted. The air was sharp, tinged with damp pavement and the fading memory of cigarettes. A light fog clung low to the ground, softening the streetlights into glowing halos. He zipped up his jacket and walked slowly, his body tired but his mind curiously alert. Micah had already gone, at least Leo assumed he had. The back door had shut behind him over an hour ago, and Leo had stayed behind, pretending to finish up the last of the inventory, but really just sitting there, turning over the night in his mind. Something about it felt different. Something about him felt different. He passed the closed storefronts and sleeping buildings, the sound of his own footsteps keeping him company. The streets at this hour belonged to ghosts. People like him who wandered because home was too quiet or too far away. In that moment, he realized he didn't feel alone. Not in the usual way. Not in the cold, hollow sense that sometimes clung to him like a second skin after late shifts. There was something softer now, something that lingered beneath the surface like a quiet hum. When Leo reached his apartment, he didn't go to bed right away. He made tea, sat on the small couch in the corner, and turned on the dim lamp by the window. The world outside was still wrapped in night, but his thoughts were wide awake. He tried to understand what it was about Micah that had unsettled him, in the most gentle, unthreatening way. Maybe it was the steadiness of him, or the way he carried silence like it was a gift, not a burden. Maybe it was the rare, fleeting moments when Leo caught a glimpse of something soft and unguarded in Micah's face, something that mirrored what Leo felt inside, but rarely showed. There had been no grand moment, no dramatic shift, just a quiet unraveling, a slow warming. And that, in itself, felt extraordinary. The next evening came too quickly. Leo found himself looking at the clock more often than usual, anticipating the lull between the last customers and the moment the lights went off. The shift was busier than the night before, with a birthday crowd at one end of the bar and a lonely bachelor party occupying the other. He moved through the chaos with practiced grace, polite smiles and clean pours, but his thoughts weren't with the patrons. They were somewhere in the back of the room, where the air was quieter and the shadows longer. When the crowd finally thinned and the lights dimmed, he stayed behind again. He moved slower than usual, dragging out the closing routine like a prayer. As expected, Micah arrived right on time. This time, Leo noticed something new. Micah's posture was more relaxed. His steps, while still quiet, felt less careful, like he wasn't just showing up to do a job, but stepping into something familiar. They didn't speak much, which was becoming a rhythm of its own. They didn't need to. Leo felt the words they weren't saying in the way they moved around each other, and how they didn't fill the silence with noise, but with presence. At one point, Leo realized he was cleaning a glass he'd already cleaned. He smiled at himself, then looked toward Micah, who had just finished mopping the far end of the floor. Their eyes met across the empty club, and in that look was a shared understanding that neither of them could name yet. Not love, not even longing, just something awake and watching. The night ended much like the one before. Micah lingering just long enough, Leo stalling without admitting it to himself. When Micah left, he didn't say goodbye this time. He just glanced back once before stepping into the night. Leo stood there long after the door had closed, one hand resting on the edge of the bar. It wasn't romance, not yet. It wasn't infatuation either. It was something slower, something rare, the beginning of being seen. And Leo wasn't sure what to do with that. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't want to push it away. The third night came like a familiar song on repeat, comfortable, expected, and yet full of subtle, shifting undertones. Leo arrived at the club earlier than usual, pretending it was to restock the bar. In truth, he simply wanted more time in the quiet before the rush, more space to think, to prepare. For what? He wasn't entirely sure. He only knew that something was beginning to take root inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The shift passed in a blur of glasses and orders, small talk and neon flickers. The usual noise felt thinner now, like it no longer reached him the same way. He moved through the motions, but his mind drifted to the moments that came after, the hours when the music stopped and the silence grew honest. When the club emptied and the last patrons stumbled into the night, Leo let the door click shut behind them and stood still for a moment. The stillness was no longer empty. It was a threshold. He looked toward the rear hallway, waiting, though he wouldn't admit it to himself. And then Micah appeared. No dramatic entrance. No fanfare. Just a quiet presence, mop in hand, sleeves pushed up, eyes scanning the space like always. But tonight, there was something different in his gaze, something steady and grounded but touched by warmth. They began as they had before, each man moving through his own small tasks. A clink of glass here, the rustle of a trash bag there. But there was a rhythm to it now, as if they were dancing around the same center, neither willing to name it but both very much aware of it. After a while, Leo wandered from behind the bar. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it. His feet simply carried him to where Micah was finishing the far corner of the dance floor. The mop was still in Micah's hands, but he paused when he noticed Leo approaching. There was no tension in his body, only awareness. That quiet, watchful openness Leo had come to recognize. They stood a few feet apart, neither of them speaking. The fairy lights along the DJ booth cast a soft, shifting glow between them, painting everything in blue and gold. The moment stretched, fragile, uncertain, and yet wholly theirs. Leo looked at him not as a colleague, not as someone who happened to share space with him, but as someone who had, without meaning to, begun to occupy a place inside him that felt dangerously important. He wanted to say something, anything, but words felt clumsy in the hush of the room. So instead, he just looked. And to his quiet surprise, Micah didn't look away. Instead, Micah did something simple. He set the mop aside and walked over to one of the booths along the sidewall. He sat down, leaned back, and glanced toward the empty seat across from him. It wasn't an invitation. It was a space Leo could choose to fill or not. He did. Sliding into the booth, Leo settled across from him. Their eyes met again, and this time the silence between them felt heavier, not with awkwardness, but with meaning. It was the kind of silence that held truths too delicate for speech. Neither reached out, neither moved closer, and yet something passed between them. A recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever had begun over the last few nights had grown roots beneath the surface. Leo studied the way Micah's fingers traced slow patterns along the edge of the table, the way his chest rose and fell with calm, measured breaths, the way his posture, usually held with quiet restraint, now relaxed, only slightly but enough to notice. Micah didn't speak, but his eyes said what words couldn't. I see you, not for who you pretend to be behind the bar, or who you've been in the past, but for who you are right now, in this dim, empty club with the world quiet and still. And Leo, for the first time in years, felt the permission to be seen. They sat like that for what could have been minutes or hours. Neither rushed to leave. Neither filled the air with small talk. The moment simply existed, and that was enough. Eventually, Micah stood. He didn't walk away immediately. He lingered, eyes meeting Leo's once more, something soft and tentative held in their depths. Then he nodded, subtle but sure, and turned toward the exit. Leo didn't follow. He stayed in the booth long after the door clicked shut behind Micah, heart full of something he still couldn't name, but could finally feel. Not love yet, but the beginning of it. The earliest light breaking through a long and quiet night. Leo arrived at the club before sunset. He had never done that before. Not in all the years he'd worked there. But something in him wanted to see the place in daylight, to watch the sunlight filter through the dusty windows and give color to the shadows he'd grown used to. The club was quieter than usual, the stillness no longer sterile but calm, almost peaceful. He moved through the space slowly, checking stock, testing the lights, pretending to be productive. But beneath the motions, his mind circled one thing: Micah. The night before had shifted something inside him. No kiss, no touch, no words even, but something had passed between them. Something fragile and significant. It hadn't been planned, but Leo now found himself thinking not about how to forget it, but how to hold on to it. By the time the club filled with music and bodies again, Leo was grounded in a way he hadn't expected. His hands moved faster behind the bar, but his thoughts stayed still. He didn't search the crowd like he usually didn't seek distraction or validation in empty glances. He just did his job and waited for the noise to end. When the last song faded and the floor emptied out, Leo let out a long, quiet breath. The ritual began again. Glasses stacked, tips counted, stools lifted, and eventually, as if on cue, the back door creaked open and Micah walked in. This time, Leo didn't pretend not to watch him. Micah moved with the same easy rhythm, but there was something in his posture that echoed Leo's own calm. He didn't head straight to the mop. Instead, he walked the length of the room slowly, looking at everything the way Leo had done hours before, as if trying to see it with new eyes. Their conversation that night was brief. A few soft sentences exchanged between duties, mostly observations, almost nothing personal. But it wasn't about the words. It was about how they stood a little closer now, how their silences had changed shape, how the glances that passed between them didn't dart away. Once the work was done, Leo lingered in the doorway to the storage room, watching as Micah returned a few supplies. He wanted to say something meaningful, but everything felt too big or too small. Instead, he waited until Micah turned toward him, and then simply nodded toward the back booth. Micah understood. No need to ask. They sat across from each other again, in the same booth as the night before. The fairy lights were still lit, casting the table in a gentle glow that softened everything it touched. Leo leaned forward, elbows resting on the worn surface between them. He noticed Micah's hands again, steady, quiet hands that looked like they carried stories without needing to tell them. This time, it was Micah who broke the stillness. Not with a sentence, but with a small gesture, his palm resting open on the table, relaxed, not reaching but waiting. Leo didn't hesitate. He placed his hand gently over Micah's, the touch light but deliberate. A silent yes. Not to everything, not to forever, just to this moment. They didn't look away, didn't laugh to cut the tension. They just sat there, fingers touching, hearts beating quietly in the same space. Leo's thoughts drifted to the way this had begun. A mop and a rag. Two people working parallel lives in a forgotten room filled with strangers and static. And now, somehow, they were no longer strangers to each other. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sweeping. It was just real. When Micah stood to leave that night, Leo walked him to the door. The alley beyond was dark, the city humming in the distance. Micah turned to face him for a moment, and in the quiet between them, something unspoken was agreed upon. They would return. They would keep showing up. They would allow whatever this was to become what it needed to be. Leo didn't sleep much that night, but when he lay down, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full, with possibility, with connection, with the sense that something gentle and true had finally begun. And in the club, long after both of them had gone, one small string of lights above the DJ booth remained on, casting its soft glow over the room that had witnessed the beginning of something neither of them had expected, but both of them had been waiting for.